Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gretel Follingstad, and this is the May 2023 Southwest Drought Briefing. I am a Regional Drought Early Warning System Coordinator with the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS. If you're not familiar with NIDIS, you can learn more about us at drought.gov. For those of you not familiar with this webinar series, we usually try to keep these briefings about a half an hour. These are casual conversations that will highlight the current state of drought across the Southwest United States and some of the great work happening across the region to help build resilience to drought conditions. These 30-minute briefings began in the 2020 Southwest Drought as part of the Southwest Drought Learning Network's monitoring and reporting team, and will continue as long as there's interest in this type of information and format. I'd like to acknowledge a few of my colleagues and primary co-organizers of these webinars who work hard each month to make them happen. These are Emily Elias, the director of the USDA Southwest Climate Hub, Joel Lisenby, who is also a drought information coordinator with NIDIS, and Curtis Riganti from the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The Drought Learning Network aims to support peer-to-peer learning by linking climate service providers with resource managers and resource managers with each other, to share ideas, experience, and information that will increase landscape and community resilience in current and future drought. Before we get started, let's cover some webinar logistics. For this webinar, everyone is muted and the webinar is being recorded. The webinar recording will be available at the NIDIS YouTube channel and at drought.gov/webinars. The format for today's webinar will be a presentation by our invited experts, followed by time for questions. Today, the questions will be moderated by Emily Elias, the director of the USDA Southwest Climate Hub. If you would like to ask a question, you may do so at any time by typing your question into the questions box within the GoToWebinar. When you log off the webinar, you will be invited to take a survey. If you have a project that is designed to help build drought resilience in the Southwest United States, we invite you to submit that as a comment if you would like to present at future webinars. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. First, we will hear from Dr. Joel Kosola. He is the Regional Climate Services Director for the Western region at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. At NCEI, Joe works to understand how decision makers are using climate information and how NOAA can best address the ever-growing needs for climate data and services. We will then hear from Jeff Herrick and Laura Hamrisk. Jeff is a soil scientist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and is affiliated with the Mortensen Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. He led the development of the nationally applied rangeland monitoring protocols and co-led the development of the National Rangeland Assessment System. He is also a member of the UN Environmental Programme's International Resource Panel and serves as the U.S. Science Representative to the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. Laura Hamrick is a program coordinator for the LandPKS at the Mortensen Center at the University of Colorado Boulder, and her role includes training and communications, research, and project management. And without further ado, I will pass the floor on to Joe for current climate conditions and outlook report. Joe?
Great, thank you so much, Gretel. And actually hop off to preserve some bandwidth there. Next slide, please. So the kind of headline statements. Since the beginning of the water year, there's been substantial improvement in drought conditions across the Southwest. There are some smaller areas or more localized areas of drought that still remain in Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado. We'll take a quick spin through some of the outlooks and for the summer, and they suggest elevated chances for warmer than average temperatures across much of the region and a potential for a below average monsoon, although these outlooks should always be taken with a grain of salt. And the last thing we'll take a look at is the kind of growing confidence in the El Nino forecast, that El Nino is anticipated to develop in the fall and persist through the winter. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of where we were at the beginning of the water year, so the end of September, October / October 1st, 2022, and you can see drought really across most of the West, with really extreme and exceptional drought in Utah, parts of Nevada, as well as some in eastern New Mexico and eastern Colorado. So next slide, where we are now. You can see a lot less saturation of those hot colors. That our wet and cold winter has really improved drought conditions across most of the region. Now, that said, there are still some localized pockets of kind of moderate, in some cases severe drought in southern Nevada and kind of Clark County, the Las Vegas area, central Utah, as well as that strip, kind of that eastern New Mexico and eastern Colorado, where there are still drought conditions clinging on. Next slide, please. And just to kind of show how we got out of drought in many of these locations, that wet, cold winter really produced abundant snowpack. And this is from April 1st, so it's not today, but this is the percent of median of the snow water equivalent on a watershed basis. And you can see these blue colors and green colors through most of the Southwest, a real bumper crop of snow. Now, melt has kind of taken hold in most of the region, although amazingly, just poking around in some places in Utah, there's so much snow that we're just now getting back to what we'd call kind of the average or median peaks of the snowpack. We were so far above, in some places record setting, that the melt has brought us back to where we might have been around April 1st. Next slide, please. So since then, I'm just looking at the last 30 days of temperature and precipitation. On the left is temperature, and these are as anomalies for the period in degrees Fahrenheit. And on the right is precipitation. That's a percentile view relative to just what that 30-day period would be. There's not actually a ton, I would say, is remarkable in the last 30 days. It's been a little warmer than average in kind of the western portion of the Southwest subregion, with some warm temperatures in Nevada and western Arizona. The only notable thing in precipitation, I would say, is kind of the Front Range in Colorado. Has gotten a decent amount of rain, in some places 6 or 7 inches in this 30-day period. For a lot of the Southwest, this is a very dry time of year. So even these percentiles, even if they're low, again, with the exception of that Front Range, the average precipitation might only be an inch or an inch and a half. And so those percentiles may actually say, oh, well, it was only about a ½ inch of rain. So kind of being too dry or wet during this period of time, I wouldn't look into too much, just to show that most of the region has not really been remarkably wet, dry, cold, or warm. Next slide, please. So looking at our storage situation, this is just for the Colorado River Basin. The upper part of the basin is on the right, the lower part of the basin is on the left. The teacup diagrams show kind of the reservoir levels relative to capacity, and you can see a lot of reservoirs are doing quite well. Lake Powell, which is kind of that lower reservoir in the right image, and Lake Mead is in kind of the middle of the left image. You can see they're hovering around 30% full, but we expect that to increase. They won't fill up totally from this one good year of rainfall and snow, but they will definitely increase. Next slide, we can look at the forecast for the inflows to Lake Powell. This is from the Colorado River Basin, Colorado River Forecast Center from the Weather Service. And this shows the evolution of the forecast for inflows to Powell. So it's not the flow over time, but it is the forecast for April to July inflows. So kind of the big part of the flow season. And you can see when the snowpack started to fall, it was looking like it was going to be maybe an average year, and then things have kind of, as the forecast has evolved, now we're looking at something more in the 11 million acre feet as being the April to July inflow. That's a great number. It's not necessarily the most that's happened. You can see the maximum in 1984, but certainly more water than has been flowing the last several years for sure. Next slide. Okay, we'll take a look at some of the outlooks now, and this is the June outlook, and you can see on the left is for temperature, on the right is for precipitation, and you can see that a decent chunk of the Southwest, or at least the Arizona, New Mexico chunk, there are better than elevated chances for warmer than average temperatures for June, and then not much signal for rainfall. You see a little bit for elevated chances for wet conditions in kind of Utah and half of Colorado, but not necessarily, it's kind of a smallish blob that we're dealing with. And relative, given the sense that it's also kind of a dry time of year, we'll be interested to see how this pans out. Next slide, we'll go to the seasonal outlook. So this is for the June, July, August period. And you can see a more extended kind of call for better chances of warm temperatures, especially around the kind of Arizona, New Mexico area at left. And at right, I think the interesting blob to look at is this kind of better chances for dry conditions in kind of the monsoon region, something to keep an eye on. I always take these seasonal outlooks to have with a grain of salt. That said, last year around this time, there was a call for better than average chances for a wetter monsoon, and those largely validated. So we'll keep an eye out for that. I do think there's also a relationship between these two. If there is kind of a drier monsoon or a less productive monsoon, then our chances for warmer temperatures go up because we have kind of less moisture around to evaporate. So yeah, this is where we are. But again, I think the uncertainty at the seasonal timescale is always quite large. So just something to monitor as we go forward. Next slide, please. And this is the drought outlook, and this is for pretty much the rest of the summer for now until the end of August. And you don't actually see a lot of action in the Southwest. Some areas where I noted where drought is clinging on in Nevada and in central Utah, the expectation is you'd have drought removal, likely from a lot of that snowpack melting. I think the problem area, though, to watch out for is the kind of continuing issues in eastern New Mexico, and then whether or not things kind of improve in some of this southeastern Colorado area. But I think as far as where drought concerns will be, the kind of eastern portion of the Southwest is where to keep our eyes focused. Next slide, please. So I mentioned El Nino, and it is kind of stunning the growing confidence in the El Nino forecast. So this bar chart shows what are the probabilities of having La Nina, neutral conditions, or El Nino in the tropical Pacific, and the x-axis shows 3-month averages. So starting currently, we are in neutral conditions, or we are in a transition out of La Nina, and things seem to be trending towards us having the El Nino develop kind of at the end of summer, and that it should persist, and you see no traces of La Nina. So I think it is a good bet that we are done with our 3 years of La Nina, and I think the thing to watch out for is will this El Nino stick around? We had a lot of confidence back in kind of the 2014-2015 time period, and the El Nino did not persist So to see if this one will, and also how intense the El Nino event ends up becoming. But the forecast models are very strongly in agreement that the El Nino is to be anticipated this fall and this winter. And next slide. I think that does it for me. Happy to take questions whenever we have time at the end.
Thank you so much, Joe. And next we will hear from Jeff and Laura. Are you guys able to share your screen okay?
I was unable to.
Yeah.
You guys, are you able to just share it, Madeline, or
Oh, I am. I'm almost there. It is.
Okay, super. Let's go ahead and that.
Thank you.
While you are working on sharing it, I'll just go ahead and start the intro. So basically, what we're trying to do with the land potential knowledge system is very similar to what the climate hubs are trying to do with climate. But we're trying to do with land. We're basically trying to make land information accessible to non-soil scientists, to non-land scientists, and make it accessible in a way that they can actually use it to make decisions. Soil surveys are traditionally very opaque to most people. They actually present a lot of very good and pretty simple information, but it's not super accessible. And so we actually started this work in Africa about 14 years ago with USAID support, because they were trying to address issues associated with drought in the Horn of Africa and with the security issues that that contribute to that, or that drought is contributing to. So a lot of al-Shabaab and the other conflicts that are occurring are in fact drought related. And in order to address those, you've got to be able to figure out how to manage your land more sustainably. And so that's where LandPKS came out of. We brought it back to the United States when we realized that a lot of ranchers around the United States were looking for the same kinds of information and the ability to access this information and also do more simple vegetation monitoring. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So LandPKS will actually do a lot of things, including accessing wildlife habitat information and soil health, the ability to do soil health monitoring. But the two things we're going to talk about today are soil identification and vegetation monitoring. Next, please. So why does soil identification matter? First, it's essential for drought planning and adaptation. We'll show an example of that in a minute. Soil type determines the water holding capacity, how much the water holds, how much the soil holds, how fast the water moves into the soil, and the types of crops and vegetation that the soil can support within a particular region. Next. It does require field observations. Everybody likes to believe that soil maps tell you what your soils are. They don't. They just predict your soils. And as a soil scientist, I find that very frustrating, but it is the reality, and it will always be the reality. The differences between the most probable soil and other soils that occur in the area and can occur at your locations can have large implications for management and make the difference in some cases between life and death. Next, please. This is a nice example. It was not a difference between life and death. This was actually my neighbor had a couple of pecan trees. He asked me to come over and cut down one of them. I did so. Afterwards, I said, why did I cut that tree down? And he said, because it never produced. I said, why didn't it produce? He says, I don't know. And I asked him a few more questions, and we finally discovered that he had been watering these two trees at exactly the same rate. That was fine in frequency. That was fine for the loam, which has enough water holding capacity to last for a 3-week drought with no precipitation or irrigation, but not for the sand. And so basically the sand, the tree was surviving, but it wasn't getting, essentially it was getting enough water, but it wasn't getting that water frequently enough. In other words, it wasn't distributed evenly enough. So a droughtier soil, a sandier soil requires more frequent rainfall events, or in this case, irrigation. Next, please. And over to Laura.
Awesome. Knowing your soil type matters. You have to go out in the field and observe it, but you're not a soil scientist. What do you do? So LandPKS is designed to help everyone go out and identify their soil. So it provides guidance for users to tell you what kind of data you need to collect, and also provides guides and different tools that help collect that information correctly. So then once we get all that data from the field, we pull in some information from national soil map databases, and then we pull that in with the data that you've collected to try to predict a specific type of soil that you have. Next slide, please. So one of the guides that we have is for soil texture, which can be kind of challenging if you haven't done it before. So we have a key that walks you through 4 different questions that you have to answer, like does the soil form a ball once you get it wet? Does it form a ribbon? How long is that ribbon? And so these animations are embedded in the app to help people kind of just in time when they're out in the field remember what they need to do in order to figure out their soil texture. There's also a nifty soil color tool, which also helps with soil ID, where you can take a stack of 3M Post-it notes, put them on top of your soil sample, take a picture, say, tap it to say this is my 3M Post-it note, and then it'll do some color correcting to try to predict your soil color. So if you don't have a 1-cell color book, because again, you're not a soil scientist, you still have a way to try to assess soil color out in the field. Next slide, please. So we talked about LandPKS can help with soil identification and vegetation monitoring. So vegetation monitoring can provide you with early warning of drought impacts, can help you make decisions around destocking land or not, and also can help with monitoring drought recovery. The cool thing about the way that LandPKS helps you collect data is that it is compatible with some different national vegetation data sets like the AIM and NRI data sets, so that you can you have data to compare to if you don't have your own historical data that you've already collected previously. Next slide, please. So all you need to do the vegetation monitoring is a yardstick, meter stick, and you go out and collect 100 points just saying there's a tree here, there's a shrub, there's a plant base, there's different types of litter on the ground. And you can then from that generate these graphs that are shown on the right side of the screen to show, your percentage plant cover, different things like that. If you collect this enough times, you can then see over time your trends in that for that particular site. So again, understanding, okay, over the past 3 months, this is what's been happening to the vegetation, or over the past 3 years, I've collected it every July, and this is what it's looked like. Go ahead and go to the next one. Awesome. So that's about it for the tools. There are lots of different things you can do with LandPKS. We're just really focused on those 2 main areas in this presentation. We are currently developing a new version of the app. So the one we have is fairly old, and so we're partnering with a tech nonprofit called Tech Matters in order to redevelop that with new UI, some improved features, things like that. So please download the app, and if you notice anything in the current version that you're like, man, it would be great if XYZ was present, or if this function worked a little differently, let us know. You can contact us at contact@landpotential.org, and you can reach out to that email with questions as well, or anything else. We also do have training videos on our website that will walk you through how to collect these different types of data in the field. So that is available at landpotential.org. I think that's it.
Great, thank you so much, both of you. Next, we will turn it over to Emily Elias for Q&A.
Oh, thanks, Gretel. Yeah, thanks for that. But I think Curtis is online for the Q&A this time around. So we'll turn it over to Curtis Regati. Thanks.
Awesome.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, just please feel free to jump into the chat if you have any questions. Haven't seen any so far. Yes, for the last presenters, I have a quick question. I apologize if I missed this, but so for the soil type identification, is there any sort of, has this been built in any sort of way to be like outreach for kids to learn how to do this? I was just thinking when I was watching, this reminds me of when I was a Cub Scout and Boy Scout as a kid doing like rock identification. So I thought this would be a neat opportunity to kind of teach kids the scientific method early on and as they're growing. So.
Yeah, good question, Curtis. So there have been a number of initiatives. The Snowpack Institute actually created a curriculum that at the time that is based on the LandPKS app, but didn't ultimately use it. And they made that decision because of the school district that they were working with at the time and the availability of cell phones for those kids at the elementary level. There's a high school program out in California that is using it for both soils and vegetation, where they're actually using the students' data to manage some of these preserves that are grazed and so forth. And we know that it's being used in a number of university classes as well. This is certainly an opportunity for somebody to come along and develop a curriculum that would actually use the phones. Great idea.
Cool. Glad to hear that. That's great. I guess a question for the first presenter. I'd have a lot of questions asked for that, but when was the most recent time that we've seen a more inactive monsoon year, Joe? I know that's what the CPC forecasts kind of seem to be leaning towards for July and August. It seems like the last 2 or 3 years have been a lot wetter than normal that time of year, if I remember right.
I think it was either 2020 or 2021. Okay. That was a drier, less of a monsoon. Yeah, definitely last year was productive, and I just can't recall if it was 2020 or 2021. I'm sure someone on the line could correct me, but yeah, it was recent. And this is kind of one of the issues with El Nino as a predictor for southwestern climate and for the monsoon. Is we had a La Nina year last year. We had a very productive monsoon. We had a La Nina year in both 20 and 2021, and we had kind of a bust. And so it does not tell the entire story for seasonal climate. And I think we have to. That's why I'm always saying grain of salt to be used with our seasonal forecast.
Right. I personally don't have any other questions, and anyone who has one, feel free to jump in here.
So Curtis, I see a couple coming in the chat. There's a question here about LandPKS. So is the data collected on the LandPKS app shareable? So can a neighbor that's downslope see any of the data? So there's a kind of a double question there.
Yeah, so the answer is if the person who entered the data decides to leave it public. So the default is public because not only is LandPKS open source, but we are also committed to open data. However, we also understand that some users may want to keep their data private. And there's a simple radio toggle button down at the bottom of the screen that allows you to make your data private or select an individual plot or site and make it private. And so if you did not make it private, it's available on the website at landpotential.org. And in the future, with the new version that Tech Matters is creating, not only will you be able to make your data private, but because it will not be hosted on a government server, it will be protected from Freedom of Information Act. And so it will be, the privacy standards will be further increased. And that's one of the reasons we did partner with this Technology for Good NGO out of the Silicon Valley, because they provide that ability.
Oh, great. Thanks, Jeff. That was really interesting. Something for me to think about moving forward. There's another question about the app, and it's, does it require real-time internet connection, noting that a lot of rural New Mexico doesn't have any coverage?
All right, Laura, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, happy to. So no, in short, no, the app does not require you to always have internet connection. So when you first set up a site, it'll pull data down with the predictions about the type of soil there. So if you know where you're going and you have data, it's better to set it up in advance so that you can pull that data and have that downloaded already. However, if you're out in the field, you can still create a site. It just won't necessarily be able to download that data immediately. Then when you get back from the field and have your observations, you can just sync it manually, and then it'll update the predictions based on the data that you collected when you were out of service.
Excellent. That's great. Great functionality and helpful for some of the areas that we work in. The next question is for Joe. Was noting that the projection for precipitation in far, far west Texas, such as El Paso, was a little disappointing. And wondering about El Nino, and you answered this a little bit, but wondering why we're not expecting cooler and wetter summer in the projections.
Yeah, good question. So where we feel more confident about El Nino's impact on kind of North American climate is really during the winter time. So the impact on the summer is the signal is very difficult to pull out of the noise. So my guess is that some of what you're seeing for that, and I'm speculating, is in West Texas is your ability to recycle precipitation is really cut into the fact that it's just been so dry in much of the region for a while. And so, and a lot of kind of this spring and summer precip, I think, is recycled, right? It's the soil moisture that evaporates and then rains back down, and that cycle continues. So when you start to dry things off, you kind of invoke that positive feedback that will then cut into your rain. And I think I would speculate that that's part of the situation in West Texas and in Oklahoma and other places up into Kansas where drought conditions are really quite severe right now.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Last question. Thanks everyone for remaining on the line. Someone asked for the Land Potential Knowledge System link, and so I dropped that into the chat for everyone. And this is for Jeff, I believe, and this is a little bit outside, but you may have an answer for this one. So how accurate is the jar test that master gardeners use to determine soil texture? I feel like, Jeff, this might be in line with your knowledge base.
Sure, yeah, so not very accurate, but that's often okay for gardening purposes. It's definitely going to tell you, well, I shouldn't say that. In most cases, it will tell you whether you have a lot of clay, a good mix of sand, silt, and clay, or a lot of sand. It's most accurate actually in really sandy soils because the sand definitely falls out. And it works a lot better if you put a little bit of Calgon in there, which is often recommended. It depends on the version of the jar test you're looking at, but throw some Calgon, some water softener in there, and that's going to help disperse all of the sand, silt, and clay. So yeah, definitely better than no information at all. You'll get a better estimate actually, or at least as good an estimate using this hand test that we've got on the phone if you practice that a couple of times. One other just quick comment relative to the app that I forgot to mention. This is a really old app. It's 13 years old now. And for an app, that's like a 120-year-old person. It's going to be completely rebuilt from the ground up. Right now, though, it's a little creaky. So if you open it up and it locks up, just do what you would with any other app and close it again. You won't lose any data. It'll just reset the thing and get you going again. And hopefully by early next year, we'll have a shiny new one for everybody to use.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm excited for that shiny new app. It reminds me of when we used to hit our television on the side in the 80s to get it to work. So looking forward to the shiny new app. Joe Casola, Laura Hamrick, Jeff Herrick, thank you so much for joining us today. The information that you heard here, this webinar is recorded and it will be available on drought.gov in just a few days. As always, we will have a drought briefing next month, so stay tuned for information on that. And this concludes our webinar. Thank you.